Overcoming by Pure Foy's Girl. Chapter 45. Will descended to see grandfather the next morning ahead of his husband with the packets in hand. Hannibal had been reluctant to agree, but in the end had put up no argument. The issue of the addendum was settled for the two of them, but it cut much deeper coming from the man Will had spent the last 6 years alone with. This was a conversation best had in private, and one Will was determined they would have. He knocked and was granted immediate entry with the low warning from Zeller, "No sneaking in food." "I would never," Will promised, and when Zeller strained a look past him, Will said, "His lordship will be along momentarily. I'm here to see his grace about some paperwork. Is he receiving?"
"You? Always,"
Zeller said, falling back to admit him with a gesture that managed to be half respectful, half mocking, much like the man himself.
"You want breakfast here with him?"
"Thank you, Mr. Zeller, that would be lovely," Will said, amused. "I'll need some time alone with him, if you please."
"I'll be right outside the door,"
Zeller said, following him through to give Will access to grandfather's bedroom proper, and closing the door securely in Will's wake.
"Well, good morning, my dear,"
grandfather said, propped up in his bed by a mountain of pillows, looking fragile but much improved with Zeller's ministrations.
"This is an unexpected pleasure."
"Your Grace," Will said, and an immediate cloud of concern fell over the Duke's lined features. Will came to stop at his bedside, solemn and still, his fondness and love for this aging alpha softening his heart. "You look very well this morning."
"And you look very pensive, my dear,"
grandfather said, wary but concerned. He was too cagey an old fox to not feel the huntsman's gaze, but too proud to flee before it. "I am pensive," Will admitted, the ache in his heart becoming more pronounced. He composed himself, aware of grandfather's eyes on him, and managed to say, "I've had a terrible shock."
"Tell me what is distressing you, and I will sort it immediately,"
Roland said, eager to put a smile back on his grandson's beautiful face. Will lifted the addendum from the packet of paperwork and handed it to his grandfather. With studied calm, he said, "I have something which belongs to you, something which came into my keeping through a very devious design." Roland took it with trepidation, his eyes scanning the sentences with growing realization.
"Will, please do not misunderstand this."
"There is very little to misunderstand in a document so tellingly thorough," Will said, moving to take a seat at grandfather's bedside, the rest of the documents in his lap and hands folded atop them. "I understand that you were desperate to get your heir, and the only way Hannibal would agree was to be free of me entirely. You did as you must to secure your family's interests, and as I had no one to see to mine, I had no way to protect myself from your decision. I relied on you to honor your promise, and you, in turn, prepared this." Roland paled, a tremor shaking his hand that pained Will to see. "If I was to judge the situation solely by what was written here, I would think myself nothing more than a means to an end. That your assurances of affection and attachment to me were little more than placatory manipulations meant to keep me content until I could bear Hannibal's child."
"You know that isn't true,"
Roland said, his hands falling to his lap, golden eyes heavy with sorrow.
"You know Hannibal well enough by now to realize he is stubborn and proud beyond all sense. This was the only way I could find to bring the two of you together again. I prayed every moment of every day since his return that you would sit before me as you did on your return. Two beautiful, beautiful young people in the first flush of love."
Will cocked his head, refusing to be put off by flattery. "It is difficult to me to think that the time we spent here in the country with only one another's company held so little sway in your heart that you would draw up such a cruel arrangement," Will said, his voice soft and low but firm. "A separation, grandfather. Not just removing Hotfoot from my care, but banishment as well. Was all my effort on your behalf so meaningless? Would my own grandfather have approved of this?" Roland flinched at the mention of Charles, pain so heavy in his pale face that Will regretted his words the moment he said them. "I apologize. I should not have mentioned him. I came here to better understand what prompted you, grandfather, not to upset you."
If there is any lesson life has taught me which is valuable enough to pass on, it's to never apologize when one is correct,"
Roland said, the richness of his alpha voice muted with unhappiness.
Charles would indeed have been disappointed in me, just as you are. He would look at me that same way, reproachful, sad. It is worse than any punishment my father or tutors could manage. But I think were he alive today, he would see why I have taken such steps.
He rallied, lifting his face to meet Will's gaze, unflinching and unrepentant as only an alpha could ever manage.
Your efforts here at Hartford have, and always will be, profoundly appreciated. And I would never have allowed you to be thrown from Hartford House, Will. I had every faith Hannibal would come to be just as smitten and in love with you as he is today,
Roland said, his mouth bowing in a frown.
Yet, if things had continued to be so cold and unkind between you that separation was as much for your sake as his, I have made arrangements through Mr. Stamets, witnessed by Margaret and Robert, that leave Marsham Heath and its income to you in its entirety, along with a substantial allowance that would see you comfortably through the rest of your days.
Will's eyes widened in shock, his surprise overshadowing his upset. The paperwork Hannibal had presented to him had contained only details of his own assets and intentions, not of Roland's, and Will was entirely unprepared to hear him say such a thing.
Considering what you have sacrificed here, your hard work in tending to the estate, and the life both Hannibal and I had sentenced you to,
Roland said, some of his tension easing when he saw Will's reaction.
I wanted you kept in comfort with a home you had wealth enough to rebuild as you please.
Will frowned, but it was thoughtful, considering, and he admitted, "You cannot claim you were doing what was best for me."
I was doing what was best for the family, as I must. The Lectors need an heir. I had put that need above all others, but once accomplished, I saw to the needs of my beloved grandchildren equally. I made a contract which granted Hannibal his freedom, and unburdened you of him in return to pursue your individual interests.
Will said nothing, merely mulled the explanations over, informed but by no means mollified.
My dear, you have been as cherished and important to me as Hannibal himself is,
Grandfather said, ruefully adding,
which unfortunately means I am not above heavy-handed tactics when it comes to ensuring you take your rightful place. I am too old to need forgiveness, too jaded to begrudge you your anger with me, and I have the luxury of never having to explain myself to anyone. But I hope you will always bear in mind that your happiness and safety are foremost in my thoughts, however cruel my actions may seem.
I know, Grandfather, Will said, because he did. His gift had made him tender toward Roland from their very first meeting, and 6 years of being together had given him precious insight into a man whose actions were often harsh, decisions made for the good of the family outweighing those made from the softness of heart or generous affection. It was no easy task being the head of a noble family. Will only hoped that when Hannibal took his place as Duke, they could manage things with less collateral damage than the old and impatient Alpha before him could muster. You wound, but always within reason. Yet you must see how this has hurt me.
I do see it, my dear, and regret the necessity,
Roland said, faint yearning in his lined and aged face.
I love you as my very own Will. I would not hurt you for the world, but if I must hurt you in order to give you the world, then I shall.
It was harsh, but not unexpected, and Will nodded, trying to reconcile his own affections for Grandfather with his new understanding of the man's capacity to maneuver those around him like nothing more than pawns. I understand Hannibal later reversed this decision regarding this paper.
Yes. The day you took your crop to him, he came to me and requested the addendum be destroyed. He wanted Hartford to remain in your keeping.
Check the date, Will softly instructed, waiting patiently when Grandfather did so. He was relieved to see the bewilderment on his face when he saw the date that had been written.
This is wrong,
Roland said, entirely perplexed.
The addendum was drawn up before Hannibal's return, and signed by him the very hour he arrived. This date is false, Will.
Hannibal confessed as much, Will said, handing over the rest of the paperwork. He took steps to have the addendum nullified in case the copy ever surfaced, but it would seem that it isn't the true copy at all. I've had admittedly limited interactions with Mr. Buddish, but I am certain he would never make such a costly mistake with the dates. I expect he could easily confirm that this is a forgery, a despicable attempt to make me believe Hannibal was only after an heir and nothing else.
You know that isn't the case,
Grandfather said, not looking at the other documents as yet, but at Will.
There is very little my grandson would not do for you, Will. I can see how he looks at you, how he speaks of you. His attachment to you is the truth, honest and absolute, and I hope that you will one day become equally attached to him.
I'm developing a certain fondness for him, Will said, and when he smiled, Roland smiled in return. I am very disappointed in you, however, Grandfather. I wish you had never taken any steps to maneuver Hannibal into such a position that it nearly put all of us in doubt of the other's affections. I understand why you did it. I simply cannot approve.
If you understand even a little, then that is all I can ask for,
Roland said, reaching out to lay his hand over Will's, the touch light but warm.
I am too old to worry about living with the consequences, my dear. Tends to make one a bit reckless.
I think, Will said, turning his hand to give Roland's a soft squeeze, blue eyes filled with affection, that you've many a long year ahead of you, Grandfather, to behave too recklessly. You must wait for the pattering of those little feet we agreed upon, mustn't you? Roland grinned, his alpha fangs bared behind his beard.
Yes, I must.
The door opened, Zeller admitting Hannibal, whose drawn-down eyebrows and slight frown spoke of a less than pleasant encounter with his grandfather's valet. Winston trotted in beside him, his wagging tail gaining force when he saw Will.
Zeller told me this morning you had returned, my boy,
Grandfather said, releasing Will's hand to straighten, arms out for an embrace Hannibal swiftly bent to offer. Will smiled as Grandfather briefly clasped Hannibal to him, giving him a firm pounding on the back that Hannibal bore with wounded dignity before he straightened and looked at Will. "Is something the matter?" Will asked, recognizing that thunderous expression.
I merely had words with Zeller regarding a certain incident he advised you on. The audacity of that man never ceases to amaze me. Have I come at a bad time?
He asked, looking toward Grandfather as well.
Have the two of you spoken?
We have, Will confirmed, gesturing Winston to his side to stroke his head. He glanced over briefly when Zeller admitted a pair of pretty maids to lay breakfast on Grandfather's small table, just next to his bed. Zeller himself settled a tray over Roland's lap, leaving Hannibal and Will to seat themselves or not as they pleased. When he left the room with the maids, he very deliberately left the door standing open.
All this business with the documents vanishing, being altered,
Grandfather said, giving the addendum an unhappy shake,
makes me uneasy.
Even more uneasy when we consider they managed to leave it in Will's suite,
Hannibal remarked, he and Will taking their seats at the small table, while Winston sat at attention next to Hannibal's chair, hopeful for treats.
Clearly it was someone who knows the house and grounds well.
Could it have been Matthew Brown?
Grandfather asked, paling to a ghostly white.
The staff wouldn't dare allow him close with all our suspicions falling on him,
Hannibal said, adding with concern.
Take some of your honey water, Grandfather. You've gone quite pale. Should I call for Zeller?
No. I'm fine,
Roland said, doing as he was bidden. He lifted his steaming cup of hot honey water and sipped it, his hand wobbling dangerously.
Matthew is the only one I can think of who has intimate knowledge of Hartford and a reason, false though it may be, to orchestrate such a misunderstanding. If not him, then who?
I have no idea who did so, or when they did so, but I can only assume it was with the intention to drive a wedge between me and both of you, which, Will said, worried by Grandfather's persisting frailty, considering the content, was not difficult to imagine.
Well, it was truly a terrible shock to you, as you said,
Grandfather said, settling his cup with care.
I will gladly make it up to you, Will, in any way you wish.
Trust me, grandfather, I've already been soundly punished for our transgressions,
Hannibal said, earning himself a swift kick to the shin beneath the table when he added,
I feared I might never leave my bed alive.
Well, that addendum has created quite a plethora of issues we must now task ourselves with resolving, Will said, sipping his coffee and determined to ignore his husband's vague references to his thighs. He was relieved that the breakfast odors didn't bother him as they had yesterday, though arguably there was little to offend when breakfast was mostly bland, cautious foods meant to tempt grandfather back to good health.
And I have already taken steps,
Hannibal said, eager to bring the other paperwork to grandfather's attention.
If you look through these, grandfather, I'll need you to witness the changes I've made. We'll call Mr. Stamets up and have him carry them personally to Mr. Buddish for filing.
And I have made my own additions to the paper regarding Hertford House in the notations below, Will went on, taking another small sip from his cup and stirring his porridge. Hertford will be part of the Lecter inheritance. If Hannibal refuses to take ownership in my favour, I wanted it explicitly stated that I am holding it in trust for our heir. This is your ancestral home, and I will not have some accident of law remove it from your keeping. Grandfather frowned and read the paper in question, his breakfast forgotten. The furrow in his brow deepened the more he read, then cleared as he reached the changes Will had made this morning. Satisfied, he nodded to himself before looking through the additions to Hannibal's will and the legal actions he'd taken to bring Will's own personal power on par with his own in terms of monetary allotments and decision-making processes.
Mr. Buddish has done excellent work on this,
he said, peering at Hannibal over the documents.
He did make you aware of the settlements I had created on Will's behalf.
He did, but I wanted to create my own,
Hannibal said, feeling Winston's muzzle come to rest on his thigh, hoping for a scone.
I never took any steps after our marriage, after all. Will now has the rights he is owed as my spouse, and the privilege he is due. I only hope I can prevail upon him to use them. With a little wheedling, of course.
Oh, you know I have no interest in burning through your fortune. All I ever need is a stream, Hannibal, Will said, casting a content look out the window in the direction of the river, wishing he were about to go fishing rather than host a large party.
I live in quiet terror of your skill as a fisherman, Will,
Hannibal said, chuckling when he thought of the dinner they'd shared, the offending trout that had slapped him and then been served to him on a bed of greens. The catch that I currently have is quite a good one, Will said, his flashing eyes returning to his husband. Or so I've been told.
And by whom, pray tell?
Hannibal, please do not needle your husband,
grandfather warned, distracted from the paperwork by his grandchildren. He gave Hannibal a repressive look and said,
I have no desire for there to be another carpet incident when our guests are due to start arriving.
Grandfather, I have no intentions of provoking Will, nor in tumbling him on carpets,
Hannibal said, murmuring into his coffee cup.
Not that one in particular, anyhow.
What was that?
Nothing, grandfather, Will said, rising to pour some milk for the suspicious old alpha. We shall both of us be at our best, I promise you.
That is precisely what scares me,
grandfather pointed out, handing the documents to Will so that he could take up his spoon, giving the porridge a woeful look.
Perhaps a bite of scone?
No, Zeller said, poking his head into the open doorway to level an offended, disapproving stare at all three of them.
No scones.
Cheeky,
grandfather breathed, taking a bite of his porridge.
I meant to ask you, Will, if you found anything amiss in those financial papers of Lord Rathmore's.
Nothing particularly, Will said, resuming his seat to finish his porridge, finding it very settling and satisfying to his still delicate stomach. But I did notice that Mr. Bronner, my father's solicitor, is listed among Mr. Verger's visitors, and I found that noteworthy.
That is rather interesting,
Hannibal said, arching a brow at Will, his fingers beginning to tap a restless rhythm on the fine tablecloth.
What on earth would he be doing visiting Mr. Verger?
I've asked myself the same question, Will said, glancing from Hannibal to grandfather. There is the possibility that he represented some appeal of Mr. Verger as being a very good solicitor and well known in the region, but I find that very difficult to support, given that Mr. Verger would have ample access to much more experienced solicitors in the capital. Yet I cannot find a single reason why my father would engage him to contact Mr. Verger. There is very little chance they ever knew one another, and Mr. Verger seemed to have no knowledge of my family when I first arrived.
Well, I for one should like to know,
Grandfather remarked, doing justice to the porridge despite his protests.
Short of stealing into his office and absconding with the paperwork,
Hannibal said, wondering if his grandfather intended just such a thing.
There is no way to know. He has no reason or right to share any client information, be it Lord Reddig's or Mr. Verger's.
Leave those details to me, please, my dear,
Grandfather said, sipping his milk.
All the two of you need to occupy yourselves with is giving the family an heir before the year is out.
Will had luckily just swallowed his sip of coffee, but his cheeks lit up with a pretty pink blush, and he cleared his throat. On that note, I shall excuse myself to speak with Mrs. Henderson and run a final check on the rooms. He rose, beautiful and collected, his scent so heady and mouth-watering that it was all Hannibal could do not to nip him when he kissed Will's hand in parting. As it stood, he couldn't resist opening his lips over Will's wrist to taste him, rich and full against his tongue. It was as if Will's heat had never left him, lingering in the fertile note to his scent and driving Hannibal to distraction with its promise.
Heavens, boy, pick your jaw up,
Grandfather scolded, chuckling when Hannibal startled, somewhat surprised to find that Will had already gone, leaving only his teasing perfume in the air. Grandfather grinned, waggling his heavy eyebrows, and Hannibal mustered a blush, saying with a touch of self-conscious reproach,
"Stop that, you randy old goat."
"You didn't inherit your appetites from your father, Hannibal,"
Roland pointed out, settling against his pillows with a content sigh.
"I couldn't be more pleased that he's off those terrible tonics, finally living in a way that makes him comfortable with who he is. There were many a nights I would lay awake worrying on just that count, convinced I had sentenced him to a lifetime of lonely isolation, pretending to be a beta male, because he was too ashamed to be himself.
I spend every moment countering the beliefs both his experiences as well as I myself have taught him,"
Hannibal said, surprised to see Winston peeking up at him when he sat back down. It was solely for a scone, however, and once Hannibal handed one to him, the little bounder dashed off in Will's wake, greedily gobbling it up.
"I have promised to devote myself to his happiness, Grandfather, and that devotion makes me plead with you now. Sign the document. Sign it to witness the others and put my mind to rest that should anything happen to me, Will has every luxury to console him in my place."
"You're sorely off the mark if you believe even a single penny would console him,"
Grandfather said, cocking his head as he gazed at his grandson.
"Will would much rather have a quiet life, spent in peaceful, honest work, than he would spending his days in idle luxury. But you know that, Hannibal. I know that you know that."
"I do,"
Hannibal said, his smile sad and distant.
"His needs are so few and simple. He truly would be content with only a stream to fish in. I suppose the only one I'm attempting to console is myself, Grandfather. I feel as if there isn't enough of me to ever make up for what I've done to him, as if even a lifetime of love and dedication would barely begin to touch the damage I've inflicted. What else do I have to offer him but worldly goods? What else can I do but enrich him to the point that, if and when he finds someone who is worthy of his heart, he has the financial security to seek a union with them, no matter their own circumstances?"
Grandfather's eyes darkened a little with pain, a faint touch of worry tinging his words when he said,
"You speak as if you expect to leave him, Hannibal, or else be taken from him."
"Not if I can help it, Grandfather,"
Hannibal said, mouth pursing in a frown as he picked at a crumb on his pant leg. He could not bring himself to look up at the old alpha when he quietly said,
"Will has a decision he has yet to make, Grandfather. I told him that should he wish to be parted from me to seek his own life on his own terms, without me holding him back, that all he needs to do is say so."
There was a long silence following that statement, contemplative and heavy.
"So, you made him independently rich in order to enable that decision,"
Grandfather said, sighing heavily.
"Not everything that brings you happiness in life must be pushed away, Hannibal. Not everything you take pleasure in will be taken away from you. The lesson Misha's death has taught you does not apply to Will."
"I know that, Grandfather,"
Hannibal said, turning his head to look out the window, because it was easier than meeting his grandfather's eyes.
I'm not pushing him away. I'm giving him the means to live as he pleases and praying with every breath that I will be enough in the end. I'm praying with every breath that he will choose me. He will, my dear,"
Grandfather said, tears shimmering in his golden eyes. His hand trembled when he groped for Hannibal's own, and Hannibal moved to take it, holding it with care.
"Love doesn't conquer all, Hannibal. But hard work, dedication, loyalty certainly can conquer far more than we properly realize. Give him everything in you, even the bad, and he will find you every bit the prize that you find him in return."
"Thank you, Grandfather,"
Hannibal breathed, kissing his cold knuckles with a smile and pressing his hand to his face. A simple gesture of affection for the Alpha, who had been more of a father to him than the man who had sired him.
"Now, run along, Hannibal,"
Roland said, turning his hand against Hannibal's cheek to pat him, giving the corner of his mouth a gentle pinch and tug.
"Help Will see to the preparations and get yourself ready. I think a nap is in order for me if I wish to be at my best this evening."
"Yes, Grandfather,"
Hannibal said, lowering his hands with care and rising, his happy smile tugging at Roland's weary old heart, the echo of the son he'd loved and battled in equal measure, reflected in the face of the grandson he adored.
"Get your rest."
He left, moving with the swift, purposeful stride so characteristic of him. A heartbeat after he passed the doorway, Zeller came slinking in to gather up their breakfast dishes. He lifted the tray from Roland's lap and asked,
"You want me to go visit Mr. Brana?"
"Yes, I think you'd best do so, Zeller,"
Roland said, gesturing at the papers that had been left behind for him.
"Put those in my safe before you go, please, and I want you to get to the bottom of this issue we have of things disappearing and reappearing when they should be doing nothing of the sort."
"I'll have to have some lettuce,"
Zeller said, unconcerned. He poked the leftover scones and then ate one in 2 bites, ignoring Roland's repressive glare.
"Should I send some to Mr. Brana?"
"I'll leave that to your discretion,"
Roland said, stifling a yawn.
"Someone in this house is interfering with our correspondences, and they are particularly interested in that which pertains to Will. We'll see what arrives and when, and what has been opened and what hasn't, and what never arrives at all."
"You have to promise me you'll mind Jimmy. No scones, none of that nonsense, agreed?"
"Agreed,"
Roland said, huffing a little at the indignities of getting old and being forced to allow pups like his pert valet to order him about, even if it was for his own good.
"Just settle it quickly. Mr. Price needs to look after Will, and I shouldn't steal too much of his time."
Zeller licked the crumbs from his fingers and graced Roland with a smug smile.
"I'll take care of it."
"I know you will. Hurry, boy,"
Roland said, smiling when Zeller very thoughtfully tucked him in to sleep. It seemed there were endless things to do before their guests began to arrive. A good portion of them would be staying, having traveled to the country on Grandfather's invitation to attend his party. It was not a small group, but it was select, and the closer the hour drew, the more Will's nerves began to grasp the enormity of this night. It would not just be his father he would be judged by, but some of Grandfather's fellow peers, the extended Lecter family, and even some dignitaries from Lituva, who would be traveling an impressive distance to relay their impression of him to Hannibal's grandparents, who were unable to undertake such a journey at their advanced age. Will was silent and solemn as Jimmy helped him to dress, not in the beautiful outfit he and Nicola had chosen for dinner, but in the less elaborate male-patterned clothing with its subtle Omegan touches, the slightly more exaggerated flare of his jacket tails, the nipped-in waist that emphasized the firm shape of his body, the open collar of his jacket over a fine blouse with his mother's brooch nestled just above his heart. The colors were not his usual somber funeral choices, but a patterned shimmering pale blue over a gold-embroidered waistcoat and white shirt.
"I feel like a peacock,"
Will breathed, his nerves showing in the tightness of his smile.
"You shouldn't, my lord,"
Jimmy said, smoothing his watch chain and bending to wipe an offending speck of dust from the toe of Will's boots, polished to such a shine he could see his own reflection in the smooth leather. "This is the height of taste and fashion, and Berger assures me it complements your husband's choice. I can say with utter honesty that you look very handsome indeed."
"Thank you, Jimmy,"
Will said, doing his best not to fiddle with his valet's fine work. Jimmy rose with a wide smile, hands folded in front of him, proud as a mother hen. "I mean it, my lord. You are enchanting and unmistakable, and you have grown into yourself so well. I'm just so proud of you." "Jimmy," Will said, touched and blushing, reaching out to grasp his hand in a light squeeze. "I couldn't have done it without you. Thank you for always taking such excellent care of me." "My lord, it has been my absolute pleasure, and I am truly looking forward to the day when there are at least 5 more little Lord Clarges running around for me to watch over." "Goodness, Jimmy!" Will's startled laughing response was cut short by a knock on the door, which Jimmy hastened to answer. Will stayed where he was, smoothing his coat, nervous that their guests might have started to arrive. Instead, Jimmy returned holding one end of a large strong box with a footman on the other end. They placed it on Will's vanity, and Jimmy dismissed the boy, fishing a key from his pocket to open it. "Has Hannibal decided that my jewelry box won't do?" Will asked, drawing closer as Jimmy opened the lock and slid it free. "No, but I think he might find it a little inadequate for the gifts he sent," Jimmy said, deftly plucking a note up from within the box to hand it to Will. Will got a glimpse of several smaller boxes within before he made himself look down at the note. It wasn't sealed, and the ink was still damp, a fact which brought a smile to his lips.
"Will, though I know that no jewels could ever compare to the changing color of your eyes, and that there is no adornment which could ever rival the purity to be found in the curve of your smile, I hope that you will accept these on the chance that they will amuse you, and in doing so endear me to you, just a little. Yours, always and forever, Hannibal." Postscript. Might I suggest the sapphires, though a pearl necklace would truly become you.
Will read the last line with a frown, asking, "Did his lordship send pearls, Jimmy?" "Not that I see yet," Jimmy remarked, giving him a quizzical look. "But probably." Will, suddenly reminded of their early morning tryst in which pearls had been similarly referenced, blushed bright pink and hastily stuffed the note back into the box, afraid he would either burst out laughing or catch fire from embarrassment. "My lord?" Jimmy inquired, as good-natured in his bafflement as he was in all things. "Forgive me, Jimmy. My husband is inclined to see me in the sapphires this evening. If you could have them readied." "Certainly, my lord," Jimmy said, delighted by the bounty. "I shall have to fetch another box from the attic. There's so very much. I have never seen such dark rubies. They're nearly black. Oh my, just so much." Will watched the jewelry box being unpacked and transferred to the dressing room, everything from necklaces to bracelets, brooches to rings, and even earbobs which made him fondle his earlobe with contemplation. Another knock came at the door, earning a yip from Winston, and Will called, "I'll get it, Jimmy." He expected another footman, but it was Mr. Berger, red-faced and smiling and dignified. "His lordship asks if you might join him in his suite for tea, my lord." "Tea? Now?" "Yes, my lord, before the vultures get here, he says," Berger said, cracking a smile. "He just wants a quiet moment with you before the night's sewn up, my lord." "There's plenty of time," Jimmy volunteered, returning from the dressing room to gather a few more pieces. "Mr. Berger, could you send someone up to get the 3rd Duchess's jewelry armoire? The 3rd, mind you, not the 4th. Hers was abysmally small." "My lord?" Berger inquired, and Will nodded his permission before slipping out into the hallway, saying, "Stay with Jimmy, Winston." It was somewhat close to time to be indulging in tea before their guests arrived, but just the thought that Hannibal wanted to squeeze in a moment of privacy beforehand brought a smile to Will's face. He touched his lips with his fingertips, marveling at how easily it came to him these days. Smiling was no longer a painful pull of muscles stiff with disuse, and the world seemed filled with things to delight him and inspire his happiness. He stood outside of Hannibal's suite for a long, silent moment, nodding absently when Mr. Berger bustled past to fetch some help, just thinking of the boy he'd been. So many years ago he'd crammed himself in the corner of his room, terrified and heartsick in a strange and frightening new place, feeling as if there would never be another shaft of sunlight to penetrate the dreary isolation that had encapsulated his world. Now he was loved by a man who would valiantly move mountains to please him, was recognized as Lord Clarges himself, his coffers overflowing with wealth he intended to pass down to children he never imagined he would bear. More, the darkness of his world had faded, midnight becoming dawn, and now bright as day, a beautiful golden glow that throbbed inside of him, fed by the bond he never meant to form. So much of what had happened between them was accident rather than design, but all of it was theirs alone. Even the terrible things, welding them together in shared experiences to grant them each knowledge of the other that no one else could ever imagine. After all these years, he was loved and happy, a precious member of a warm and welcoming family with a home that was his for the rest of his life, his childish dreams realized with such excess that it left him breathless. The door opened before him, startling him, and when he blinked, hot tears rolled down his cheeks despite his wide smile. Hannibal, momentarily frozen, roused himself to reach out and grasp Will by the hand. He pulled him inside and closed the door against prying eyes before he cupped Will's face in his hands, peering down at him to puzzle out what he was seeing.
"I had the strangest feeling you were happy,"
he whispered, naming the reason why he'd gone to the door in the first place, certain that Will was there. He wiped at Will's cheeks, gathering his tears up with gentle fingertips, and then with gentle kisses, murmuring,
"Tell me what has hurt you, Will. Tell me and I will fix it."
"Nothing," Will said, his voice raspy with tears. He uttered a soft, short laugh and grasped Hannibal's arms, telling him, "I am happy, Hannibal. That's all." The bond surged again, a spike of pleasure and delight and relief that made Will laugh again, closing his eyes as his lids were kissed and his tears were sipped from his lashes.
"As if it is such a small thing,"
Hannibal purred, easing back to fish his handkerchief out and wipe Will's face.
"I hope every day of our lives together brings you to tears with happiness, Will."
"There is a very good chance it will," he admitted, embarrassed but still smiling. "Thinking of my father made me remember how desperate I was to escape his control and the hope I'd harbored to be part of a family." Hannibal wiped away another spill of tears, his smile sad and his heart breaking all over again for the child he had rejected so long ago. "And now," Will said, drawing a deep breath to steady himself, his face aglow with joy, "I am." Hannibal wrapped both arms around him, squeezing Will up tight to his chest. He stroked Will's curls, smiling, eyes closed to savor this moment. It was no small victory to hear his mate say such a thing, and it gave him hope for the future, for their future together. They stood in comfortable, content silence while Will composed himself, flushed and half embarrassed, but secure in his husband's love for him. Hannibal felt him relax and gave Will's nape a final squeeze before he eased back to cup his face.
"Jimmy will scold me for making you cry,"
he murmured, smoothing the faint tracks of tears down Will's soft cheeks once more with his handkerchief. "He wouldn't," Will said, chuckling softly, taking the handkerchief from him and following Hannibal's touch with his own to wipe at his face. "He would, however, heartily disapprove and leave you in no doubt about it. He is a force to be reckoned with."
"I expect so,"
Hannibal said, amused. He pressed his thumb to Will's lower lip and traced the curve of it up to the corner of his mouth.
"Better?"
"Calmer," Will said, drawing a deep breath and tucking Hannibal's handkerchief into his sleeve. "I can't think what's gotten into me recently. It isn't like me to be so easily overwrought."
"Your self-control would put a stoic to shame. I think you're due a little indulgence in your emotions after being kept from them for so many years, Will,"
Hannibal said, following the touch with a soft kiss.
"The imminent appearance of your father again after all this time would be enough to try anyone's mettle. Anything you need to do in order to prepare for that is entirely warranted, I should think."
He urged Will to a small seating area where a tea set was already laid out. 2 unfamiliar cups and a steaming pot with simple plate of biscuits, a very modest offering in all, but one Will welcomed. He sat carefully, smoothing his coat beneath him and arranging his jacket as he settled back, unable to feel self-conscious around his husband. The extra flounce took some getting used to, but by the gleam in his husband's amber eyes it would be worth the hassle.
"I wanted to tell you how stunning you looked when I first saw you standing there in my doorway, but I found myself breathless at the sight of you,"
Hannibal told him, pouring for them both and handing Will his cup before taking his seat. He had moved the chairs, arranging them just a little closer to one another, and settled his booted feet almost touching Will's crossed ankles.
"I'll remedy that now. You look exquisite, Will."
"Thank you," Will said, hiding his smile behind his teacup as he took a sip, his blue eyes wandering over Hannibal's own afternoon outfit. It did match his own, as Jimmy had said. the soft hues complementing the blue tones in his jacket, muted but for the slight sheen of a pattern, an interlocking design Will found fascinating. I had to do justice to the fine wardrobe my husband so generously supplied me. After some wheedling, of course.
Of course,
Hannibal agreed, pleased and not afraid to show it. He sipped his own tea, eager to share his surprise with Will.
Perhaps I can wheedle you in exchange. As your knees are safely covered and your stockings out of sight, I might yet keep my wits about me.
Will laughed, the sound trailing off on a slight smile that prompted Hannibal to ask,
What are you thinking of?
How much things have changed, Will said, thoughtfully swirling his tea, which was not at all bitter, and just how he liked it. How easy it is to laugh now, how readily I smile. I can see how much I've changed you, and I see how much you've changed me in return.
For the better, I pray.
Who knows? Hannibal chuckled, sighing a little, and content just to watch him sip his tea. In a few short moments he had the pleasure of seeing Will's eyebrows drawn down, and his blue eyes squint down as he stared into his cup. Hannibal? Will asked, turning the cup around and tilting it, seeing that there was, in fact, something painted within. He hastily gulped the last swallow of his tea, and took another look, bursting into surprised, raspy laughter. Painted into the bowl of the teacup was the arched body of a trout, curved with fins outstretched as if swimming, or being flung at someone's head.
Hannibal, what on earth?
He asked, laughing again as he took a look at the outer design, finding the pattern resolved itself into more trout swimming and leaping in a stylized river. He angled a wry look at his husband, who managed to look both aggrieved and amused at the same time. Fish! Shall I be forever haunted by one impulsive act of frustration?
I am sorry, Will, but I'm afraid it made quite an impact,
Hannibal said, so somber and serious that Will laughed again, turning the teacup in his hands to see the full scene, and taking another peek within at the curled trout.
I felt such a meaningful sacrifice deserved immortalized in a tea set for two.
Just for two? Will questioned, turning his attention to the pot which, as he suspected, held another pattern of river-bound fish, the paddle so subtle that he had not even remarked it at first.
Yes, just for two,
Hannibal said, shifting to scoot the box from Gideon and Garnet's out from beneath his seat. That's very brave of you, considering, Will said, his smile dimming at the thought of the teacup he'd smashed, one of only two, disrupting the set forever.
This is my gift to you,
Hannibal said, pleased he'd managed to surprise his mate.
But I do have something else you might like, if you're interested.
Will's eyes snapped to his, wide and eager, answer enough for Hannibal to scoop the box up as he stood. He settled it in Will's lap and went down on one knee at his side, whispering,
I hope you'll like it.
Heart hammering, Will lifted the lid on the box, and for a moment he could not make sense of what he saw. When he did finally realize, he pressed his hand to his lips, unable to speak for a long, painful moment. The shattered teacup had come together again, nestled into soft, fine velvet atop a bed of wool. He reached in with trembling fingers and touched it, tracing the seams of gold that had told the story of its suffering, the force with which it had been flung to the ground. It was an act which should have destroyed it. But it hadn't. It survived despite the insult, its wounds healed to scars shimmering in the fading daylight. You brought it back together, he whispered, the words tremulous. He couldn't look at Hannibal, didn't dare to for fear he himself would fall apart, cracking into a million tiny pieces all over again. But his scars were already filled with gold, his pieces pulled together, sewn and mended and sealed against harm by the love this man held for him, every moment of it a gift that was treasured and celebrated with pure delight.
I promised you I would,
Hannibal purred, eyes sweeping half-closed when Will's hand moved from his mouth, and his beautiful mate leaned over him to embrace him. He trembled so hard against Hannibal that all he could do was breathe.
I love you, Will. I swear to you someday I will manage to undo the damage I have done to you.
Will's arm tightened against his jaw as he shifted, lifting his head to cradle the cup in his hand before Hannibal. It's beautiful.
I know it isn't like it was before.
Whoever is Hannibal. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. I can never take back what happened to it or bring back those pieces that were lost, but the empty spaces have been filled and the teacup has come together again. He eased back to look down into Hannibal's face, joy shining in his eyes, his happiness so exquisite that it took Hannibal's breath away all over again. "I never thought I would see such a thing, Hannibal. I thought it was destroyed beyond repair," he said, and bent to press a kiss to Hannibal's forehead, lingering and soft. "Thank you for keeping your promise. Thank you for giving it back to me."
"I always will,"
Hannibal said, shifting up to kiss the tip of his nose.
"As many times as it takes for as long as it takes, day and night, until I draw my last breath, Will."
Will tipped his head and their mouths met in a soft kiss, the cup between them safely in Will's hands. It was a short, sweet kiss, a gentle show of tenderness, and when Will pulled back, he said, "Hannibal, A knock came at the door, interrupting them.
"Yes,"
Hannibal whispered, urging him to finish, but Will only shook his head, silent and almost chastened, the cup cradled to his chest. Crestfallen, Hannibal got to his feet and called,
"This had better be supremely important."
The door opened, admitting Mr. Berger, who looked as if he would rather be on a storm-tossed ship rather than intruding on them just now. But he did his duty all the same.
"There's a coach coming down the lane, my lords."
"Oh, it is rather later than I realized," Will said, flustered by his interrupted confession. He busied himself, putting the cup back into its box, and closed it up, safe and secure within.
"Who is it?"
Hannibal asked, offering Will a hand as he stood, both of them falling still with unease when the answer came.
"It's Lord Reddig, my lords."
Will took a deep breath, pulling Hannibal's alpha scent deep into his lungs. It calmed him, but he made no move to leave. He simply stood there, the box with its teacup pressed to his chest, the color instantly drained from his cheeks.
"Thank you, Berger,"
Hannibal said, shooing his valet out. He returned to Will and cupped his face.
"I will go down."
"Hannibal."
"I will go down. You take all the time you need. I will be there when you're ready."
"I'll not let you fight my battles for me, Hannibal."
"For you, never,"
Hannibal said, baring the tips of his alpha fangs in a small smile.
"But together, we could slay dragons together, Will. Your father is hardly that."
He could sense Will's reluctance and pressed ahead.
"You're my husband, Will. Your battles are my battles, just as mine are yours. That means when you tire, I fight in your place as you would in mine. There is no weakness in tiring, having fought alone for so long."
Will's eyes held his, but as difficult as it was, he finally nodded. "I'll be down in a moment. I just need to put this away someplace safe." Hannibal smiled, relieved, and headed toward the door. He paused there on his way out, turning when Will said, "Hannibal?"
"Yes?"
"Thank you," he said, shifting the box. "For everything."
"You never need to thank me, Will,"
Hannibal said, back to him with a smile. He moved out into the hallway, closing the door behind him, leaving Will with a secretive smile, clutching the box like a lifeline in his hand. Grandfather was already firmly situated in the parlor, his wheelchair parked with wide clearance on either side for Hannibal and Will. Zeller was nowhere to be seen, Hannibal noted, which meant either Grandfather was feeling well enough to handle the chair himself, or else he'd sent him off somewhere out of sight. He certainly looked a world better, though fragile and drawn.
"Ah, Hannibal, there you are,"
Grandfather called, his smile fading when he asked,
"Where's Will?"
"On his way down,"
Hannibal said, moving to greet Mina, who reclined on the settee in an artful pose. He kissed her hand, saying,
"You look very lovely, Lady Rathmore."
"Thank you, Hannibal dear," she said, pleased. "I was very pressed to have anything decent to wear for dinner tonight. With the two of you gone, I spent every waking minute ensuring His Grace's party was prepared for."
"Indeed. I'm sure Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Hawkes are extraordinarily pleased they could manage."
He moved to Grandfather's side, saying,
"Burgess said it was Lord Reddig."
"There was some happenstance at the head of the lane,"
Grandfather said, straining a glance at the door, eager to see his guests.
"The Dimmins are now in the lead."
"That will please them. Aunt Grace likes nothing more than to be the first to arrive and the last to leave."
"Lady Brayton is always such a delight,"
Mina said, turning where she sat to better speak with them both.
"She is ever so companionable."
"That is because she has no idea what you ever say to her, Lady Rathmore."
Hannibal chuckled, and Grandfather stifled a laugh, disguising it as a cough. The door opened to admit Will, and Hannibal breathed.
"I had hoped to have his father in hand before he came down."
"Why, Hannibal, whatever do you mean? That is an odd thing to say, to be sure. First salacious spoons and now taking father in hand? I never seem to understand you.
I doubt you ever could,
Hannibal conceded, managing not to sound too boastful.
Luckily your brother understands me enough for us all.
Will was the picture of solemn poise coming toward him, his ever so faintly Omegan attire highlighting his athletic build, from his broad shoulders to the slight curve of his hips. He was perfectly beautiful to Hannibal, every aspect of his dual gender blending together into a magnificent whole.
You're doing it again,
Grandfather whispered, and Hannibal shook himself, a wide, pleased smile curving his lips as Will neared. Mina, you look beautiful, Will said, taking Hannibal's offered hand and allowing himself to be drawn in at Grandfather's side. And Grandfather, you look like you're in high spirits.
I am, my dear,
Roland said, nudging Hannibal over to make room for Will.
I am quite looking forward to the evening. It has been an age since we've held an event here at Hartford.
Yes, that was badly done of you, Will, keeping his grace isolated out here with no entertainment at all,
Mina scolded, smoothing her hands up her forearms.
Though how on earth would you have found the time? Running yourself ragged, dealing with the estate like a commoner. Father would simply die to hear such a thing.
I'll be sure to tell him in that case, Will said, and Mina gasped, moving at once to the window in scandalized silence. There was a movement at the door, and Will smiled, delighted to see Anthony and Freddie instead of his father.
Yes, your favourite has... Gods above, Miss Lowndes, why on earth are you wearing men's clothing?
Hannibal asked, shocked by the sight of her feminine charms on such display. She matched Anthony as if they had planned their wardrobes, though her tightly braided and bound red hair was still a shocking splash of colour.
Good evening, Lord Clarges,
Freddie said, smiling slightly, with her beaming fiancé escorting her to greet them.
These are not men's clothes, I am sure of it, as I ordered them made for myself. That makes them my clothes, does it not?
Hannibal gathered himself to remark on that, and then checked himself, sudden realization flooding him when he saw that her throat was bare, in the traditional Omegan fashion. Her scent reached him then, cinnamon spice with an undertone of apples, and that elusive quality which served to tell his senses that she was, in fact, Omegan. He looked at Will, rendered speechless for a long moment. "You look very handsome, Freddie," Will said, reaching out to take her hands in his greetings.
"Thank ye, Lord Clarges,"
Freddie said, using his title with obvious relish.
"I do still prefer the feminine in a dress, but Anthony insisted we match."
And make a clever announcement?
Hannibal muttered, glaring at his cousin.
You both look very fine indeed,
Roland cut in, grasping Anthony's hand as well as one of Freddie's.
I want all of my children to behave tonight. Am I understood?
Far more so than Miss Lowndes has been,
Hannibal said, frowning.
Why did no one tell me? Hannibal, even the children knew,
Anthony said, chuckling softly.
You are in a league of your own, old boy. No protests, I trust.
He said it with a slight, telling sniff that instantly made both Hannibal and Will aware that their time together during his heat had not gone unremarked amongst the family.
If you would like to keep that nose, I would recommend you stick it elsewhere, Anthony. Perhaps in your...
Behave,
Roland warned again.
The wedding will proceed next summer as scheduled, children. You will hear no protest from anyone, will you?
Certainly not from me, Will said, amused by Hannibal's ire. And I doubt Hannibal would protest such a match when he spoke out so publicly in support of Omegas, though he does tend to surprise us all.
I am incensed with your opinions of me, all of you. Naturally, I would not protest. I would never dream of doing such. I only wish Miss Lowndes had shown more care in her choice, and not settled for such an obvious fool as my cousin.
I am very forgiving of his faults, Lord Clarges,
Freddie said with a smile, linking her arm with Anthony's.
As he is a mine.
I cannot believe no one told me,
Hannibal said, whispering it to Will as Anthony and Freddie moved away to speak with Mina. Will very studiously did not make any sort of eye contact with him, but his lips curved up in a smile he simply could not repress.
Why would they not tell me?
Hannibal pressed, hurt that his efforts had made no impression on his family. Roland immediately found the table to his right terribly absorbing, ever so much more so than his grandson's questions.
Was I really so badly thought of they feared I would disapprove?
Hannibal asked, pressing his hand to Will's waist again, where it preferred to linger when they stood near one another. It was almost as if it had a mind of its own, seeking Will out when he was not aware of it. You were, and are, very highly thought of, Will corrected him, his skin tightening where Hannibal's fingers trailed, even through his layers of clothing. Which is why they feared your rejection. It is difficult to be looked down on by someone you admire, Lord Clarges. Hannibal sniffed slightly at that.
I wouldn't know.
Hannibal's brow arched up over one wry blue eye, but he didn't remark, and Hannibal was thoroughly disappointed not to be scolded by him. Bedelia and her adult children arrived in close attendance, with Aunt Grace and Uncle Robert, followed at length by Great-Aunt Margaret, in a huff about something or another, by the tone she was taking with Mr. Hawkes. Bedelia lingered behind as the Dimmons paid respect to Roland, smiling slightly at Robert's gushing, delighted greeting to Will, while Grace loudly inquired where Anthony had gone off to, and somehow managed not to hear anyone say precisely where. "Things have gone well for you, so I hear," Bedelia said, as Hannibal took her hand, their conversation unheard over the bedlam of Fernhill Dimmons attempting to sort themselves. She cocked her head in Will's direction, amused by his indulgence of Robert's persistent attention. "Though not as well as one could hope, perhaps?"
Bedelia, I could never say how grateful I am for your instruction,"
Hannibal said, dropping a kiss on her knuckles and clasping her hand tightly in both of his own.
"Without you, I might never have found my way back into Will's tolerance, and there is every potential for an heir at last."
A slight, almost imperceptible smile curved her mouth then.
"That is truly the best news we could ask for." "I should hope so, after the way you have hounded me half to death for the better part of 2 decades.
"I refuse to apologize for our rightful concern, Hannibal," she murmured, her half-lidded eyes deceivingly sleepy. "But I am very happy to see that I could assist you with learning the proper way to behave, if only for Will's sake." Hannibal cast a warm glance at Will, who was actually smiling at Uncle Robert, laughing even as his hand was given a boisterous, chivalrous parting kiss. "Will," Bedelia said, turning her attentions at once. "You look so very beautiful, but you always do." "Thank you, as do you," Will said, his good humor partially restored by Uncle Robert's unfailing high spirits. "It is a pleasure to see you again." "Yes," Bedelia said, smiling. "It is a pleasure. I hope that in the future there will be many more festivities like this one, between Fernhill and Hertford."
"There is the strangest man in the drive, brother," Aunt Margaret announced as she approached, ostensibly to Roland, but managing to include the entirety of the room. "Very bad-tempered, very ill-mannered, for a gentleman, I should think."
"Aunt Margaret,"
Hannibal said, attempting to hush her. Will paled, his sudden retreat into silence unremarked by anyone save Hannibal.
"He was scolding his servant in the middle of the lane, Hannibal,"
Aunt Margaret complained, thumping her cane imperiously.
"You should have him removed at once. I do hope he is not to attend this evening, brother."
"Excuse me, I should check in with Mr. Hawkes," Will said, taking an abortive step away that Hannibal promptly blocked as he pawned Aunt Margaret off on Grandfather.
"I will go,"
Hannibal told him, patting the small of his back.
"You stay with Grandfather and greet our other guests."
Faced with the reality of seeing his father again, nervous tension swelled up to swallow Will in strained, encompassing dread. Grateful for his husband's offer, Will could only nod, eyes closing briefly when Hannibal pressed a brief kiss to his forehead. He remained next to Grandfather in uneasy silence as Hannibal left the parlor, hastening to intervene. There was a bad-tempered man outside, just as Aunt Margaret had said. Lord Reddig had finally arrived to Hertford House.